Sometime in 1881, George W. DeLong, along with the 33 men on board the Jeanette, were trapped in the polar ice. It had been a year since they were free. But this was part and parcel of polar expeditions. They had supplies to last a long, long time, and were somewhat used to it. But then people on board started to hear the noise. It was almost unnoticeable, but before long, it started to grow and grow and grow. Then they realized, seen what that noise meant. The Jeanette was being ripped apart by the polar ice. The 33 men and DeLong were about to be left, all alone, 300 miles from solid land. And worst of all, the expedition they had been sent on was completely pointless from the moment they left. The Jeanette expedition had started in much the same way that countless others had, in hopes of reaching the North Pole. DeLong himself wasn't completely inexperienced when it came to polar expeditions. He had been aboard the USS Jeanette in the 1873 trip to Greenland, in search of the missing Polaris expedition. This experience had convinced him in the value of polar exploration, so much so that he was desperate to launch an expedition of his own. But he had no way of funding a full expedition to the North Pole. So in the end, he pinned his hopes on getting assistance from members of the public. And this is where James Gordon Bennett stepped in. He was, at the time, around the late 1800s, known as one of the richest men alive, and also one of the wildest. He was the heir to one of America's most well-known newspapers, the Herald, and was fond of any scheme, no matter how strange, ridiculous, or downright dangerous, if, in the end, the story could manage to sell newspapers. An expedition to the North Pole seemed to fit that bill almost perfectly. He immediately agreed to fund a large part of the venture. As he saw it, even if the group were unsuccessful, there's still a great story in the ill-fated North Pole expedition that had to be rescued from certain death. Although he failed to mention that part to DeLong. The rest of the funding would come from the US Navy, mostly to provide a supply ship for the expedition, carrying extra fuel and rations until the group would hit the polar ice. They would also run the expedition ship, the Pandora, a ship that had plenty of experience in the Arctic, even if its small size didn't always give that impression. They would also provide the crew, on the condition the ship was commissioned into the US Navy. It wouldn't be until July 8, 1879, that DeLong, the Jeanette, now renamed from the Pandora, and his crew of 33 men would finally leave San Francisco for the North Pole. The path the expedition would end up taking was largely influenced by August Peterman. He believed that an ice annulus, or ring, surrounded a completely ice-free polar sea, and that if it could be punched through, it would lead you all the way to the North Pole. Peterman also believed that if a current of warm water could flow high enough and with enough strength, it would be able to puncture a hole through the ring of ice and create a path for any willing expedition to move through. For the Jeanette expedition, the current picked was the Kuroshio. It flowed along the western Pacific Ocean, carrying warm water northwards. It was this stream that Peterman believed, and the expedition were relying on, to carry them a large part of the way to the North Pole. Making their way north, the men would leave the comfort of their support ship off the coast of Alaska. Then they would head straight for the ice, the two Inuit dog drivers and sled dogs taken aboard, providing some much-needed experience for what they were about to go through. By the beginning of September 1879, the ice was starting to surround the ship more and more, but DeLong, though positioning himself in the crow's nest, was determined to reach Wrangler's Island before the ice glued them in place for the winter. From afar, whaling ships could see the smoke billowing from the stack on board the Jeanette, as DeLong forcefully tried to ram his ship through the ice. Then would begin a long process of jumping from small lake to small lake, which at this point was the only free water in the ice. In the end, they would never reach Wrangler's Island. At least not this winter. Instead, the ice had taken a grip of the ship, sealing it in place for who knows how long. From now until the ship was freed, they would be at the mercy of the weather. And as if this wasn't bad enough, the US Coast and Geodetic Survey had just been conducted, and it conclusively showed that the Kuroshio Current had almost no impact on the Arctic ice. The data and its conclusions had only become known just after the men had sailed from San Francisco. So now the 33 men on board the Jeanette were stuck in more ways than one. Physically, they were stuck on the ice, but now they were also stuck investigating a theory that had just been proven wrong. The first few months of being stuck on the ice were almost as uneventful as the trip to get to the Arctic. But like most dangers, they don't get you in an instant, but instead it's a slow, constant pushing, much like the Jeanette was experiencing being squashed by the ice either side of it. As time went on, underfoot would become sticky. The glue between the ship's boards was being squeezed to the surface from the pressure alone. Not only this, but the ship was being forcefully listed more and more. And then, on January 19th, 1880, what every single one of the 33 men on board feared happened. The hull was breached by the polar ice. The Jeanette was taking in water rapidly. DeLong, to his credit, immediately prepared to abandon ship. But due to the fast thinking and even faster action of Nindemann, a man with previous Arctic experience, and Sweetman, a carpenter, they would rush through the freezing Arctic water and start stuffing whatever they could get their hands on into the breach. They were eventually able to somehow create a pump system to remove the water flowing into the ship, and the issue would be fully rectified with the construction of a new, watertight bulkhead that sealed the ship completely. For the remainder of that winter, and in fact the year of 1880, the newly repaired ship was seen to aimlessly drift alongside the ice, making little to no progress towards their goal of moving northwards. DeLong would even write in his diary, "I begin the new year by turning over a new leaf, and I hope to God we are turning over a new leaf in our book of luck." The onset of the Arctic summer in 1881 had brought a small bit of hope that the ship would be finally free from the ice that had kept it locked up for the previous year. And for a short period of time, they were free, floating in a small lake. But the weather changed quickly, and the ice came back with a vengeance. This time, the hull was ripped apart completely beyond repair. They were going to have to abandon ship, over 300 miles from the Siberian coast. Despite the sinking, the efforts of everyone on board and the leadership of DeLong meant that the men had managed to get a good amount of supplies off the ship, with an adequate amount of food and fuel, and more tea than they knew what to do with. This caused there to be no initial panic about their situation. DeLong's general plan was to march with dogs and sleds to the New Siberian Islands, somewhere to the south, and then use the emergency boats they managed to get off before the Jeanette sank to carry his party to the Siberian mainland. From there, they would beeline for the nearest settlement that they could find. But try as they may, the ice wasn't willing to cooperate with their attempts to make progress. As the team tried to move southwards, the drift of the ice north cancelled out every single step the men would take. At this point, only 22 out of the 33 men were even capable of pulling the numerous supplies needed for the entire group. Each sleigh out of the 7 that they would have to pull weighed roughly 1,200 to 1,500 pounds each. This would not be an easy task if they were well rested, fed, and in good conditions. But tired, hungry, and in the middle of the Arctic, it seemed almost impossible to keep pulling. Regardless though, they kept trying to make progress south. Eventually, the weather and the ice relented, and they were able to move closer towards their goal. But that would bring different challenges. The ice that, at this point they were used to sleighing over, started to be replaced with more and more open water. As they headed further south, the ice disappeared completely. The aim for the group was to eventually hit the Lena Delta in Siberia. But from where they were They had to leave much of their supplies and abandon their sleighs for their boats. There were 3 groups, one commanded by DeLong himself, another by George W. Melville, the ship's engineer, and the final one would be under the command of Charles W. Chipp, the second in command. Through August and September of 1881, they would all be at sea. By September the 11th, they would be some 90 miles from land, with only 7 days' rations left. DeLong was growing more and more worried about whether or not they were even going to make it back to dry land. Never mind the miles and miles they still had to cover once they reached it. Nobody had ever made it back from their ship being squeezed to death in the Bering Strait at this point, but no one had ever covered as much ground as the Jeanette expedition, and DeLong was going to try like hell to make both himself and his men the very first. But it was exactly when they thought that maybe, just maybe, they might be able to come out of this adventure and live to tell the tale that disaster struck. Approaching the Lena Delta, the 3 boats were hit by a massive storm. This caused them all to separate. DeLong somehow managed to hit the Lena Delta almost exactly, but the other 2 ships weren't as fortunate. Melville and his boat drifted far to the east, miles and miles from where DeLong landed. This would turn out to be a blessing in disguise, but it has to be said that the worst fate of all fell on Chipp and the men in his boat. It ended up disappearing during the storm and was never seen again. It's presumed that the boat probably capsized with all 8 men on board. The remaining 2 boats and the men inside them were now back in solid land for the first time in what must have seemed like ages. But their struggle wasn't over yet. They still had to reach civilization and safety, something that was far, far away. Melville, having landed far from DeLong, decided to follow the largest part of the delta that he could find, all the while cursing Peterman for the wild goose chase he had sent them on. Luckily for both him and the men with him, they were able to find a village where they were able to get food, rest, and then get messages back to a larger settlement so help could be sent for. When they had left the ice and gotten into their boats, the 3 groups had aimed to head to Boulogne, a predetermined meeting place and a settlement some 100 miles away. If Melville's group could make it there, they could organise a search party for DeLong, but with how weak many of his men were, and the fact that the ice had not fully frozen yet, he was convinced by villagers to wait another 2 weeks, and then set out for the settlement. While Melville was feeling the comfort of reaching safety for the first time in actual years, DeLong and his group had no such luxury. Having landed in the northmost part of the delta, this section was almost like a maze, resulting in them having no idea where they were going. In the end, they decided to head as far south as possible, and hope, in the end, that they would hit a village or settlement that would provide them with the salvation they so desperately needed. But every settlement that they thought they were going to hit on the map Peterman had provided proved not to exist. As time went on, and with no sign of civilization anywhere, starvation started to become a real worry for the group. With winter slowly starting to creep in, it would drive all the animals southwards. Before long, the group were completely out of food to hunt, and their rations were empty. By the 3rd of October, they had killed and cooked the last of their dogs and mascot, Snoozer. The situation was now critical. Making things worse was the constant risk of frostbite. The group were getting hammered from every direction, and the way out started to look non-existent. One by one, their limbs started to succumb to gangrene. And then, on October 6th, the first of the group died. All they had at this point was a ration of 3 ounces of alcohol per day. Becoming desperate, DeLong told the 2 fittest members of the group to leave them, giving them a rifle, 2 ounces of alcohol, and a small version of Peterman's map. A map that at this point was probably more useless than useful. They left on October 9th to try to get help. The others would move slowly behind them. Both of those sent ahead would never see DeLong or the rest of the group alive again. DeLong's diary towards the end of October would tell a horrible story of what the group went through as help failed to materialise. Saturday, October 22nd, 132nd day. Too weak to carry the bodies of Lee and Kayak out on the ice, the doctor, Collins, and I carried them around the corner out of sight. Then my eye closed up. Sunday, October 23rd, 133rd day. Everybody pretty weak. Slept or rested all day, and then managed to get enough wood in before dark. Read part of divine service. Suffering in our feet. No footgear. Monday, October 24th, 134th day. A hard night. October 27th, 137th day. I have some broken down. 138th day. Iveson died during early morning. 139th day. Dressier died during night. 140th day. Boyd and Ortiz died during the night. Mr. Collins dying. The two men sent ahead would make it to Boulogne, the settlement all the groups had been aiming for when the Jeanette had been squeezed beneath the ice. Shortly afterwards, on November 2nd, they would be joined by Melville. He would go on to look for his missing leader without the two men, as they were too weak to join him. Following a map drawn by them, he wouldn't find the men alive, but would only find their logs. Soon, the snow began to fall, and the weather was growing way too dangerous to continue further northwards, towards where the men had last been seen. Instead, he would have to wait until the early spring so that he could gather their remains. He knew, looking at the condition of those from the group that had made it to Boulogne, and the weather, that there was no hope for DeLong and his men. That's if they were even alive at this point. When spring did arrive, DeLong and the members of his group would be buried roughly where they laid. Eventually, though, the remains of DeLong and the rest of the expedition members who lost their lives in the Siberian wilderness would be repatriated to the US, and thus ending one of the most challenging and disastrous expeditions in history. The Arctic had claimed another set of victims, but they weren't the first, and they wouldn't be the last. In the end, there can only be one first. But in the case of the Arctic, there can be many last voyages and many last expeditions. May those of the Jeanette expedition rest in peace.